House Resolution 583. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment is quite similar to the prior one, but it wouldn't just strip the cash out of the bill. It would not require further security assistance to Ukraine. And I offer this amendment because the Biden administration is sleepwalking our great country into a world war. The American people did not sign up for this, and I believe Congress needs to have the solemnity to be able to stop this madness. I miss the days when Democrats used to be anti-war. And I listened with great interest as the ranking member, who I have great respect for, said the goal of this entire Ukraine-U.S. enterprise is to ensure that we are not going to war with Russia. And that is a bit odd to hear after several Democrats have taken to this floor and media outlets to suggest we are at war with Russia. It was, in fact, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, who came to this floor and said, we are at war with Russia. It was the gentleman from Massachusetts who just spoke on the prior amendment, who said functionally the same thing. I do not want to go to war with Russia, and I don't think the American people do either, and that does not make anyone pro-Putin. I would similarly observe that part of the funding assistance that we are providing to Ukraine has nothing to do with the military. In this country, we have cops, we have firemen, we have teachers who wonder whether or not their pension fund is going to be sufficient to cover their life for the service that they have given. And while that is a question in our country, it's no question in Ukraine, because the American taxpayer is underwriting all of the pensions for every single government official in Ukraine, and we don't do that for the people who put out our fires and protect our streets. Similarly, how can we continue to just send all this money when there's a lack of accountability? The Pentagon has to fess up that they have multi-billion-dollar accounting errors in this space. And when we had the Inspector General before our House Armed Services Committee, he could not testify that our country had followed our own requirements and our own laws regarding the end-use monitoring of equipment that we are sending into a combat zone. We have unfunded needs in our own military, and I support the NDAA. I'm grateful that we've done a lot of work, but even with this NDAA, in America, there will be hangars that are rusting out. In America, there will be platforms that need upgrades, and they will go wanting, while Ukraine seems to have an unlimited amount of support in this Congress that is unwarranted. 40% of our training aircraft can't even fly in this country because we don't have sufficient parts to be able to get it to them. This war will end anytime those folks in Europe want it to. But they keep buying the Russian gas, and they keep expecting all of us in America to subsidize Europe's defense while they provide some massive social welfare state. I'm not for it, and that's why I would encourage my colleagues to vote for my amendment, and I reserve.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I claim time in opposition to this amendment. I yield myself as much time as I may.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment is consistent with certain members of the Republican Party's continued opposition to aiding Ukraine. Our security assistance to Ukraine over the past year plus has been crucial to Ukrainian efforts to counter Russia's illegal, immoral, and reprehensible invasion of another sovereign nation. If Vladimir Putin and our foreign adversaries can invade other countries without any response from the United States or our allies around the globe, then every country in the world becomes less safe. The United States is not fighting a war in Ukraine. We are giving Ukrainians the weapons they need to fight the war for themselves and defend their country from totalitarian invaders. We must support our friends who are standing on the front lines of the fight for freedom in this world. I oppose this amendment forcefully and urge my colleagues to do the same. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
For what purpose does our gentleman from Florida is recognized?
Mr. Speaker, I am at a loss when my colleagues asks without any response from the United States. It's already been $115 billion that we've authorized. One hell of a response, I would say, but there has to be some point in time where we put our country ahead of Ukraine, and that's what this amendment does. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Indiana, Representative Sparse.
Thank you. I have to say there are some things I agree with my colleagues on the Republican side, and actually it's good to have healthy dialogue and discussion. We're a free institution here. I actually agree that we need to defend our borders too. I actually agree that we need to have better oversight and go to better security assistance and not some other things too. I actually agree with them that we need to have, the fiscal issues resolved with Department of Defense and offered amendments. But I disagree that Ukraine is not in national interest. Stopping this war and deterring aggressors like China and Russia, it is in our national interest. Many Americans were killed by Russian-made weapons around the world, and we need to learn from mistakes of World War II that weaknesses invite aggressions. And I truly believe this administration didn't do as good of a job deterring it, but now we need to help Ukraine, and we need to understand that, there are a lot of lives are going to be lost for Ukrainians, but we need to make sure that we don't have never-ending war, and better and faster security assistance will be help to restore peace. I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Ohio, Representative Capter.
Gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. The millions of Americans whose families sent loved ones over to the European theater during World War II so liberty could be bequeathed to us understand what an enemy really is and what sacrifice is required. The Ukrainians are fighting their own war against Russia's invasion. History is clear, however, on what horrors transpire when national leaders appease a virulent enemy of liberty. Appeasement is read as cowardice, acquiescence, weakness, and even worse, succor to the enemy. Give no succor nor encouragement to liberty's enemies. Defend freedom. Freedom means never surrender, never acquiesce, never waver, never fail liberty. I ask my colleagues to join me in full support of Ukraine and to defeat any amendments on this floor that in any way would inhibit victory for Ukraine. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from South Carolina, Representative Wilson.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, Congresswoman Victoria Sparks is correct. We can learn from the lessons of World War II. There was weakness, and with that weakness, the Imperial Japan attacked China. Then ultimately, on December the 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. We must be resolved to resist by having peace through strength. I personally can identify my father served in China and India during World War II with the Flying Tigers to stop the tide of imperialism at that time. Today, we can learn from history. Today is the 79th anniversary of the liberation of Guam. We don't need to repeat the weakness that has occurred. We need to stop our enemies today, and these authoritarians have plans to dissolve the United States, and we need to stop it now. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
They accuse this amendment of being born of weakness. Guess what, Mr. Speaker? It does not make America stronger to borrow money from China to give it to Ukraine. And you know who we're appeasing? China. Because as we engage in this endeavor, China is doing a leveraged buyout of Russia. We see that in Eastern Russia. We see that in the Russian assets in China. So we're actually helping China, weakening ourselves, all to figure out which guy in a sweatsuit gets to run Crimea. And that doesn't seem like America's interest to me. I reserve.
Gentlewoman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Washington State, Representative Smith.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I actually think the gentleman is correct. China and Russia are very closely aligned. And if you are concerned about Chinese aggression in the world, you must also be concerned about Russian aggression. I also note that when he quoted me on what the policy was, he conveniently left out the first part. He mentioned, yes, we don't want to get into a war with Russia. He left out the first part, which is preserve a sovereign, democratic Ukraine. And this is what President Biden and his team have done an excellent job of. Nobody thought Ukraine could survive this long. But thanks to their courage, their willingness to fight, and 53 nations that have coalesced to help them, they have been able to preserve a sovereign, democratic Ukraine. And I want to place a strong emphasis on that. I know Americans are rightly worried. Is it just us standing up for these principles in the world? In Ukraine, it is not. It is 53 nations that are contributing across the board to this. 53 nations that believe preserving economic and political freedom requires us to not let an autocrat like Vladimir Putin run
All
over
time for
Ukraine.
members opposed
Please
has
oppose this
expired.
amendment.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Inquires of my remaining time.
1 1/4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the funds sent to Ukraine represent a major investment in war, not national defense, or building infrastructures to deter conflict. This is the active engagement in the killing of sons, daughters, husbands, and wives abroad. We shouldn't be funding these actions until the defense of our country can be reflected with some sort of tangible connection. And the money to Ukraine does not fulfill this objective. There must be a threshold for funding a proxy war. How much will it take to win? What is the return? When will it end? The Biden administration does not have answers to these questions, and until they do, we should stop sending money to these misadventures. The United States of America is not the world's police force, and we are not the world's piggy bank, but they would have us become the block captains of Kyiv. My amendment is going to lose overwhelmingly when it is put up for a vote, but the American people will see who wants to represent them or who wants to represent Crimea. I yield back.
The question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. The question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those who oppose say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.